Welcome to Noha's narrative where everything feels real and something hides deeper. The girl with the yellow curtains, the drive to Millfield took 40 minutes and Natalie spent most of it watching the fog settle low over the fields. She had volunteered for the charity's home visit program almost by accident. Gemma had signed them both up in a moment of enthusiasm and Natalie, who rarely said no to Gemma, had agreed before he could think better before of it. The program paired volunteers with children in foster care, bringing small gifts and conversations. Nothing grand, just presents, just proof that someone thought of them. The house of Sycamore Lane was narrow and shallow with a front garden that had clearly been loved once and was being loved again. Flower pots lined the porch, some still empty, some bursting with early marigolds. Natalie knocked and heard small feet thundering toward the door before it opened. Rosie was 7 with 2 loop-sided braids and gap where her front tooth should have been. She looked up at Natalie with a kind of open, uncomplicated curiosity that only children carry so naturally, like a gift they don't yet know they are holding. "You bought a bag?" Rosie said. "I did." Natalie told her there might be something in it for you. That was enough. Rosie stepped back and let her in. Cora Bell, the foster mother, was a soft-spoken woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and floor on her sleeve. She shook Natalie's hand warmly and offered tea, and the three of them sat together in the small sitting room while Rosie tore into the craft kit Natalie had brought with focused delight. The visit was supposed to last an hour. Natalie didn't mind it if it ran longer. She had nowhere to be. That was the good truth of her life these days. She had rebuilt it carefully, steadily, but it was still a life with more empty hours than she liked to admit. Owen had been gone 5 years since she had come home to a silent apartment and a cold cup of coffee and the particular terrible stillness that meant something had broken beyond repair. She had grieved, she had searched, she had eventually reluctantly learned to carry it. Rosie finished gluing a paper butterfly and held it up. "Come see my room," she said. It was not a question. Natalie smiled and followed her down the short hallway, ducking slightly under the low door frame. The room was bright with yellow curtains that caught the afternoon light and turned it golden. Drawings covered one wall, horses mostly, and a small bookshelves held a collection of picture books with cracked spines. A little lamp shaped like a cloud sat on the besides table, and beside it, on a shelf at exactly Natalie's eye level, sat a framed photograph. She almost didn't look at it. Her attention was Rosie, who was pointing proudly at a drawing of what appeared to be a horse wearing a crown. But something pulled her gaze sideways, a habit maybe, or instinct, the kind that lives below thought. She looked at the photograph. A man stood in front of what looked like a lake, hands in his jacket pockets, face turned slightly toward the camera as though someone had just called his name. He was smiling in that quick way that didn't show his teeth, the way that meant he was genuinely happy and not just performing it. The blood in Natalie's body seemed to stop moving. She knew that smile. She had watched it cross her face every morning for 6 years. She had kissed the corners of it. She had missed it every single day for 5 years. "Who is this?" Her voice came out softer than she intended. Rosie glanced at the photo and shrugged with the casual ease of a child who does not yet understand weight. "That's the man who was kind to us," she said. Cora said his name is Robert, but I think he looks more like a Henry. Natalie's hand moved to the shelf. Her fingertips stopped just short of the frame. Robert? Owen had never been called Robert in his life. She stood very still and listened to Rosie explain that the man had helped Cora through a difficult time, that he had fixed the porch steps and brought groceries twice, that he had come twice and always knocked before entering, that he had gone away some months ago and hadn't come back. Natalie looked at the photograph on one more time, at the jaw she knew, the hands she knew, the particular tilt of the shoulders. Then she turned to the Rosie and said very carefully, "He sounds like a good person." "He was," Rosie said simply. Then she went back to her horse drawing. Natalie stood in that little yellow room and felt the entire architecture of the past 5 years begin to shift. The name they would not say. Natalie did not rush. That was the hardest part. Standing in that small bright room with yellow curtains and a photograph that had just turned her world sideways, the choosing to be still. She had learned stillness the hard way in the months after Owen disappeared, when panic had gotten her nothing but sleepless nights at dead ends. So she breathed. She looked to Rosie's horse drying and said something kind about the crown. Then she walked back down and the hallway to where Cora Bells was refilling the kettle. "Morty," Cora asked without turning around. "Please," Natalie said. She sat down at the small kitchen table and folded her hands in front of her. The photograph was still burning behind her eyes. She needed to be careful. She needed to be very, very careful. She wanted until Rosie had settled on the sitting room floor with her craft kit and her quick concentration before she spoke. "That photo in Rosie's room," Natalie said, keeping her voice light, conversational. "The way you talk about nothing important. She mentioned a man who helped you. Robert," she said. Cora's shoulder moved slightly, just slightly, a small tightening that someone less watchful would have missed entirely. "He was a good neighbor," Cora said. She poured the tea and brought the cups to the table and sat down. Her face was composed, pleasant, practiced. "People come and go in this neighborhood. He was one of the good ones." "When did he leave?" "Oh," Cora wrapped both hands around her cup. 8 months ago, maybe 9. "He did not say goodbye properly. That was a little unlike him, I thought, but people have their reasons." Natalie nodded slowly. "Did he live nearby?" "Just 2 streets over, a rented place on Bridge Road. He kept to himself mostly, but he was always willing to help if you needed it." Cora smiled, and the smile was genuine but guarded. The smile of someone who had decided in advance how much she was going to share. Rosie adored him. He used to bring her little things. "He sounds very kind," Natalie sang the same words she had said to Rosie, and she meant them both times, which made everything hurt more. She looked down at her tea, then she said quickly, "Can I ask you something honestly, Cora?" The older woman's eyes settled on her face with a new kind of attention. "You can ask." "The man in that photograph," Natalie paused. She had rehearsed this in her head, and now every version of it felt inadequate. "I think I might know him. Not a Robert. I think I might know him by another name entirely." The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere in the sitting room, Rosie hummed something toneless and content. Cora sat her up down. She did not look surprised exactly, but she looked like a woman who had been waiting, without knowing it, for this particular conversation to arrive. She was quiet for a long moment, then she said, "How long have you been looking for him?" Natalie felt the air go out of her chest. 5 years, she said. Cora closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, there was something careful and sad in them, a sorrow that belonged to someone who knows more than they have been permitted to say. "He told me once," she said slowly, "that there was a woman he had left behind. He never said her name, he never said why, but the way he talked about it, you could tell it was the one thing in his life he was not at peace with." Natalie's throat tightened. She said nothing. "He called himself Robert Fincher," Cora continued. "He had documentation. I never asked question about it because he was gentle and reliable, and Rosie was going through a difficult stretch. And sometimes you take the kindness that is offered without demanding its entire history." She looked at Natalie steadily. "I'm not a foolish woman. I knew something did not quite fit, but he never once frightened me or her." "You were not," Natalie said, and her voice cracked slightly on the words. She pressed her lips together. He is not a frightening man. He is just gone. He's been gone. He has been gone, and I never understood why. Cora reached across the table and touched Natalie's hand once, briefly. The gesture of a woman who knows when words are too small. Then she stood and went to the dryer beside the sink and refilled and reflected through it for a moment. She came back with a small piece of paper folded in half. He left this, Cora said. He said if anyone ever came asking, I would know by how they asked whether to pass it on. She set it on the table between them. You asked the right way. Natalie looked at the folded paper. Her name was not on it. Nothing was on it. She reached out and picked it up and opened it with hands that were steadier than she left. The handwriting was Owen's. She would have known it anywhere. The slight leftward lean, the way his letters were larger at the start of each word and grew smaller toward the end, like he was always running out of space. Sat Millfield's library, the blue notebook, third shelf from the bottom. Local history section. I'm sorry, I have always been sorry. That was all. Natalie read it twice. Then she folded it again and held it in both hands and sat for a moment in Cora's Bell's warm kitchen, listening to Rose hum in the next room, listening to her own breathing find its way back to something. Even he was protecting someone. Cora said softly. It was not a question. I think so, Natalie said. I just don't know who. She thanked Cora. She hugged Rosie, who smelled of glue and something sweet, and who pressed the paper butterfly into her hands as a gift. She walked out into the afternoon. She was cooler now, the fog thicker along the tree line. She sat in her car and did not start it for a full 3 minutes. Then she looked up the address of the Millfield library on her phone, pulled out of the driveway and drove. The truth that cost everything. The Millfield library was the kind of place that smelled like time, old paper and wood polish, and the particular quiet that only exists where many people have come to be alone together. Natalie pushed through the glass door and stood for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the warm indoor light. A young man at the front desk looked up and smiled the automatic smile of the someone paid to be welcoming. She nodded back and walked past him without stopping. She found the local history section without asking. It was tucked along the back wall, slightly apart from the main floor, the kind of the corner that only people with a specific purpose ever reached. The shelves were old oak, darkened with age, and the books on them had that particular stillness of volumes rarely touched. Natalie crouched down and began moving along the third shelf from the bottom, running her finger across the spines. The blue notebook was between a book about Millfield's founding families and the volume on local waterways. It was an ordinary composition notebook, the kind you buy in packs of 3 with a faded blue cover and no label. Someone had tucked it so naturally among the other books that you would never notice unless you were looking. Natalie pulled it out and sat down on the low wooden step stool nearby and opened it. Owen's handwriting filled the first page completely. If you are reading this, then something went right, which means for a long time something went very wrong. I will try to explain. I owe you that much. I owe you more than that, but explanation is what I have. She turned the page. He had written in it like a letter, long and unbroken without headings or pauses, the way a person writes when they have been holding something in for so long that once they begin, they cannot afford to stop. Natalie read slowly, going back over sentences, making sure she understood each one before moving forward. The story that emerged was this. 3 months before he disappeared, Owen had discovered something inside his own company. A pattern of transactions he had not authorized, money moving through accounts he barely recognized, small enough amounts each time to avoid triggering alerts, but consistent enough. Over 18 months, to add up to something that could not be explained. He had started quickly investigating on his own, not wanting to alarm anyone until he understood what he was looking at. What he found was that someone inside the company had been using Owen's business as a channel for laundering money connected to Victor Shade, a name Natalie recognized from the papers years ago, a property developed with a reputation for being untouchable. Owen had gathered the evidence carefully. He had been about to take it to the authorities when the man had come. Not the man who had approached Natalie in the parking lot. Different man earlier who had come directly to Owen and made the situation perfectly clear. They were not interested in negotiation. They were not interested in the merger either. Not really. What they wanted was Owen's silence and his continued cooperation, a legitimate business face behind which certain movements of money could continue undisturbed. Owen had refused, and then they had told him what they would do if he went to the police. They had a file on Natalie where she worked, her schedule, the route she ran each morning, the coffee shop where she met Gamma every Thursday. They had photographs. They had made it clear that his silence was the price of her safety and that they were entirely serious. Natalie stopped reading. She pressed her hand flag against the page. She thought about the man in the parking lot. She thought about the warning they had delivered to her, the one she had gone upstairs to tell Owens about, the one she had never gotten to tell him because he was already gone. He had not known they would approach her directly. He had vanished, believed that his disappearance would keep her safe, that if he was simply not there, not findable, not useful, they would have no reason to come near her. He had been wrong about that, but he had not known. She kept reading. He had spent 2 years moving carefully, staying close enough to track whether Natalie was being watched, far enough away to give her what he believes was protection. He had eventually ended up in Millfield by accident, a car breakdown on a rainy night, a room above a hardware shop that turned out to be cheap and quiet, and then Cora Bell's porch steps had needed fixing, and Rosie had looked at him with that uncomplicated openness, and he had stayed longer than he planned. He had contacted Detective Frank Miller anonymously. 18 months ago, he had sent the evidence. He had waited. The last entry in the notebook was dated 4 months back. Millfield tells me it is nearly done. The case is built. Victor Shade's organization is being taken apart quickly. From the inside, he says, in a few months it will be safe. He says, I can go home. I don't know what home means anymore. I don't know if she would want to be back. I don't know if I deserve to ask, but I left this here because I'm not brave enough to say it to her face until I know she is ready to hear it. And I suppose I am hoping the act of finding it will tell me something about whether she still is. Natalie closed the notebook. She sat in the back corner of the Millfield library for a long time. Outside, the afternoon was fading toward evening. The young man at the front desk had switched on the overhead lights without her noticing, and the warm glow of them fell across the oak shelves and the old quit books and the blue notebook in her hands. She thought about 5 years. She thought about grief and anger and the long, slow work of learning to live inside an unanswered question. She thought about Rosie pressing a paper butterfly into her palms. She thought about Cora saying, you asked the right way. Then she took out her phone and called Gamma. I need you to get me Detective Frank Miller's number, she said when Gamma answered, and then I need you to sit with me while I figure out what I want to say to my husband. Gamma was quiet for exactly 1 second. Then she said, I'll be there in 20 minutes. Do not move. Natalie looked down at the notebook. I'm not going anywhere, she said, and for the first time in 5 years, she meant it not with resignation, but with something that felt carefully and tentatively like twice. Thank you.